You know, and so think about the rate, if you take an overlay of the development of computation and wireless capabilities since 1960, and then you had a parallel overlay with health, with biology and with brain science, you get a similar kind of explosion of new capabilities, new things, new solutions, new products in a way that will be extraordinary. Finally, I believe that we have to also look at the use of modern technology and building models of caretaking so that we use everything we're learning, frankly, everything the Japanese are learning. The Japanese have invested very heavily in robotics for healthcare because they refuse to allow people in their country to do the work that in this country is often done by people who come here. And as a result, the Japanese have a huge labor shortage for labor-intensive industries. And so they're really trying to figure out, and I'll give you one example that came up in our Alzheimer's working group, which is if you're the spouse and your husband gets Alzheimer's and you get to a point where you have to help him get in and out of bed, as a general principle, the spouse suddenly is in danger of hurting her back trying to help him. Now there are ways to make that dramatically different, and there are ways to use new technology so that you could have, in effect, an intelligent home that actually helped take care of somebody in a way that was both less expensive and was far more convenient and had fewer health problems for the people who were the caregivers. And so those are the 4 zones I want to work in, and I'm looking forward to a meeting with the experts here in a little while to talk about how we go forward. But in the interim, just to come back so you understand why this campaign has been so different. This is a very big idea in an area that I don't know of any political leader who's willing to tackle, that would lead to a dramatic explosion of new science, that would lead directly to a better quality outcome for health, which would lower the cost of health care, which would help solve our long-term budget problems, and would create a huge new zone of growing American jobs. But it requires having a conversation in an area that people just aren't used to talking about politically. And so that's typical of what I want to try to do with this campaign, is to lay out a series of breakthroughs, each of which moves us into the future, so that when you graduate from college, you're more likely to have a job, and a job that rises in value, and a job that's competitive in the world market, and a job doing something that's both interesting and is very dynamic. And that's sort of the heart of what this campaign's about. So I'd like to, if it's all right, let's toss it open, and I guess if you yell, we'll try to. Yes, sir.
With all due respect to yourself and the people who have Alzheimer's, why are you dealing with small potatoes? The most significant issue in the country from a health perspective right now is the lack of physical activity and obesity. And it affects more than 2/3 of the people in the country and more than 30 diseases. Why not take your solutions for the exact reasons you offer and apply them to the problems of obesity and lack of physical activity?
Well, look, I'm in favor of us maximizing physical activity and maximizing good diets. And I had a student the other night who asked me whether, this was in Windham, New Hampshire. He was a 9th grader who asked me if I thought it was really appropriate for Congress to pass a directive that pizza's a vegetable. And I suggested that it probably wasn't. So I agree with you on both nutrition and on diet. And at the Center for Health Transformation, we had a fairly substantial project on diabetes and on avoiding diabetes by having the right diet and the right exercise. So I'm in agreement with you on that particular zone, but that doesn't preclude me from also talking about this. So we can agree that both of them are important areas.
Well, why don't you invest the money in the disease that has a more powerful effect on?
I actually don't think obesity is a problem of money. Obesity is a problem of culture. And obesity is a problem of getting people to get up and walk. Obesity is a problem of getting people to eat less junk food and to walk more. And those two things
Why
change.
don't we do that?
Huh?
Why can't we do that?
Well, we can. I actually recommend you that there's a company in Green Bay, Wisconsin, which has done a very, very good job with its own employees of getting them and their families to be dramatically healthier by incentivizing good health. Jeb Bush ran an experiment in Medicaid where if you were diabetic or you were asthmatic, if you took care of yourselves, you got a Christmas bonus because you had saved the government so much money by not going to the emergency room that they could afford to actually reward the good behavior. And they got very substantial changes in behavior because it turned out poor people like money. I mean, it was a very bold breakthrough concept. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, this private profit justify all, and the Republican Party seems to focus on the areas for manufacturing cash flow. But if you look at the prevention side, such as the structure of our cities, the greening of our cities, the bringing mass transit in so that we make nice neighborhoods to be in so children enjoy walking to school and they can walk to school, that would do a lot to reduce obesity and increase social health, psychological health, mental health, physical health.
I agree. I don't disagree.
And one of the main deterrents to an image, to a paradigm like that is the profiteering at the construction level and the focus that people seem to value private profit more than they value the health of their community and the health of their neighbors.
Well, okay, I'm not sure that I quite jumped to that conclusion. I mean, I can agree with you that cities that are properly planned, but frankly, most of Iowa doesn't need mass transit. Most of Iowa, when you talk about obesity and diabetes, is a local thing that can involve things like bicycling, it can involve things like walking.
It takes long-term planning and vision to get a community to prevent the chaos and the catastrophic sprawl.
Well,
It's really
okay, you and I probably disagree on that. I think most of that chaos is people seeking a better way of life. Yes?
So brain science is really hard, as evidenced by many big pharma companies dropping their neuroscience programs currently. What if America can't make a profit on this? What's your plan B?
Well, look, there are a lot of things we do that we don't make a profit on. I mean, I think that the whole goal of life is not automatically to make a profit. On the other hand, if you look around the world, systems that reward achievement seem to create greater wealth, higher quality standards of living, do better, frankly, even by the environment. Successful societies are much better at taking care of the environment than failed societies. So I would suggest to you that the profit motive isn't the end of everything, but it is also not in and of itself a bad thing. And I realize I'm on a campus where that may be, in some classes, that may be a radical statement. But as a general, I'll give you one example. The Soviet Union was a terrible manager of the environment because communism turned out to be nobody that was responsible for anything. And if you look at the worst places that were polluted in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, they weren't a function of the profit motive. They were a function of a really bad government-owned system that had no controls and no honesty and no concern for the future. So I think you can have profits and have a healthy society. Yes, sir.
In the past 10 years or so, we've seen a lot of high-profile cases in which drugs that went through the FDA approval process were later shown to have deleterious effects. You spoke of streamlining that FDA approval process. So, and of course, the Joe Salk example plays into that example, plays into your point there. But how do you balance public safety with things like Vioxx and other sorts of drugs with improving efficiency and getting drugs to market?
Well, I'm a very strong advocate of health information technology. And I'm a very strong advocate of being able to monitor on a depersonalized basis what's happening. And if you take Vioxx as an example, that first showed up as a problem in several large systems that had millions of people's records that were electronic that they could scan and suddenly say, something's happening here that doesn't make sense. When you have an electronic health record, you're actually able to improve sooner because you're able to monitor more closely. And you can tell whether or not, in most cases, it's not that it's a terrible drug, but it's that there are some circumstances under which people shouldn't use it. And so you can actually have a much more finely modulated system of approval and constant monitoring to see whether or not you've taken too big a risk. Yes, ma'am.
Speaker, thank you for being here. I'm a second-year medical student, and it's an honor to be having this conversation on our campus. As a future physician, and also in a time of budget deficit, I'm curious what you can do to make sure that these research proposals and this funding, we have physicians that are available to implement the cures that we might come up with. I'm particularly concerned with graduate medical education cuts in funding that might occur, as well as an Iowan. What would be your thoughts on physician retention and ensuring that there are physicians in rural
Well, first of all, I think we should expand the programs that in effect reward you by helping pay off your student loans if you have them. If you stay in areas that are underserved by doctors, whether they're urban areas or they're rural areas. I think that's a program that has worked in the past and that does have a positive impact on doctors making a decision when they leave. I said back in the 90s when we first began looking at this in 95, 96, that I thought we were in real trouble in how we had funded medical education, because historically we had cross-subsidized. And so you would charge more in one zone in order to have the money to then be able to subsidize the education program. As that became less and less possible because of the economic pressure, I always thought we ought to consider seriously going towards more of a fellowship program and recognize that there's some base number of doctors, just as there's a base number of scientists, that we really want to produce annually. And we need fellowships rather than loan programs to get people to go into areas where they require a lot of learning and a lot of dedication and giving up a lot of their time. And I was partly influenced because I had a National Defense Education Act fellowship to go through graduate schools. I borrowed some money, but I also had a Georgia State scholarship, which I had to pay back unless I taught in Georgia. And so it gave me a very high incentive to find a college in Georgia that was willing to hire me. Yes, ma'am.
So kind of coming along with the question that she had come along with here, you were talking about a private public kind of sector thing like the DNA sequencing to try to get some more of this basic science about this figured out.
Right.
Exactly what mechanism were you thinking of achieving that through? Me being a graduate student here in a science program, I'd like to see that be more of like money going to NIH and supporting graduate students like me getting this basic scientist research, which then would also further support our future economy by training more scientists that can do basic research across all the fields, which would also do neuroscience. So what mechanism were you thinking of? Could you go more into that public-private thing you're thinking about?
I'm thinking a couple things. When you say private, remember also there are a lot of research foundations that also, and that's a growing area as sort of the World War II generation and their successors get older. You have people who are setting up very large private foundations that ought to be seen as part of a network of knowledge and a network of learning, in addition to for-profit companies. I would say that if you look at the Human Genome Project, which originally was at the Department of Energy because NIH didn't want it, and only when the Department of Energy started did NIH said, well, if that's the case, I think we'd rather have it here. If we have to do it, even though we don't believe in it, we'd rather do it here than do it over there, because it would be really embarrassing to have the Department of Energy actually having the breakthrough in human genome. But if you look at how that was run, I've spent a fair amount of time with the current director of NIH, who was the head of the Human Genome Project. It was much more mission focused. I am personally dubious about the very small grant peer review model, which ends up with too many scientists spending too much of their time filling out too much paper. And I'd much rather see long-term grants for 3 to 5 to 8 years and centers of excellence and an ability that you would know that you were part of a long-term project to achieve a major breakthrough, which worked historically. If you go back and look at the Apollo project, we had a clear mission focus. We knew what we were trying to do. We were trying to get to the moon. The Human Genome Project had a similar kind of mission focus. And if you look at what ARPA, and then later it was called DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, did in the development of modern computing, I mean, they had a multi-year investment process that without the government investment in research, you wouldn't have the laptop, you wouldn't have the home computer, you wouldn't have the internet, you wouldn't have much of what we think of as the human interface. All that stuff came because a handful of people, Linklater at MIT is one of them, came to Washington and spent years funding research and development around the country in a very methodical way. I mean, really trying to figure out, what's the next piece that's missing. And I'd like to see that kind of mission-oriented goal with a very specific goal. We want to maximize the rate at which we learn the totality of what we need to know about the human brain to affect all the manifestations, some positive. Can we get much better learning theory? Some very important to life. Can we solve depression, bipolar disease? My mother had bipolar disease late in her life. Can we deal with schizophrenia? The number of things we'll learn by learning about the brain will absolutely pay for itself, probably by 1,000 to 1 or better, in terms of literally cost to the government, because these are very large drivers of cost to the U.S. government. 1 or 2 more, I think, and then they're going to yell at me.
We're almost out of time.
Okay, 1 more.
Yes, sir. You talk about money not being everything, but you have taken plenty of shortcuts to get your millions publishing your books and marketing them. and it seems like you have a PhD